Okay, everybody, welcome to World Building. I've been told at the last minute that I'm our moderator. My name is Timothy Gwynn. I'll let everybody else introduce themselves. Maybe we start with you.
Okay. I'm Roxanne Barber. I write adventures in science fiction and some three-line poetry, speculative fiction.
Nice. I'm Christine Perrin. I write adventure science fiction. I write the series Warp World that I co-author with my Texan co-writer. I'm a former professional stunt performer. So yeah, a lot of action in there based on real-life experiences.
I'm relatively new at the writing gig entirely. This is my first book, Avians. It's been drawing critical praise for world building, and here I am.
I'm David Coe. I've been writing professionally for some 20 years. I have 19 novels in print and many short stories, and I've done several series, so I've created several worlds and have firmly kind of embraced the God complex involved in that process.
Now, the first time I sat out there at a world building panel, I wasn't sure what to expect. So I'm going to let you guys tell us what we're going to talk about aspects of world building. I take it literally. I'm a planet builder. But world building encompasses magic systems and social structures. You want to start?
I'm most interested in aliens, quite frankly. So I like to build different aliens. They generally look bipedal, but they have different cultures and different ways of being, and I want to integrate all those differences into the novel.
Nice. My area of, not expertise, but let's say the area that I like the most is the biological area. So when I build a world, I'm really interested in the critters. I'm really interested in the flora and fauna. I'm also a discovery world builder, a discovery writer. So I tend to build my world as I write, as opposed to building the world and then starting the story. And there's different schools of thoughts on that, but I'm a discovery writer.
I wanted to write a story about a greener form of aviation. I'm a pilot by day, and I needed a world where fossil fuels and metal aircraft were not the norm, and I ended up writing a book about girl power. So it took me in interesting directions, but I think the world building for me was a strong foundation to storytelling, and that's something I'd like to explore. But on to you.
I write a lot of fantasy, and my fantasy worlds tend to be populated almost entirely with humans, and so much of my world building falls under the rubric of creating kind of human institutions, creating cultures and societies, politics, religions, historical lines and stuff of that sort. And I find that for me the most important aspect of world building is keeping in mind as I write that world building isn't something we do at the beginning of a book. It's a process that we continue throughout the writing of the entire narrative. And so looking for ways to incorporate the world building into the storytelling in the most organic way. That's what interests me about it.
Okay, there are two topics pre-listed for this panel in the guide, and one of them takes an angle at looking whether you can do too much world building and get so immersed in that you lose track of the story. And I'm opposed to that point of view. I think enriched world building is more immersive. But does anybody feel that they may have gone too far at some point, got so bogged down in the details that they spent a month churning over, what color is the ocean?
Yes. Here. Yes, short answer. The end, moving on. No, so the manuscript I was working on prior to the series that I now write, I spent a year researching details and got finicky to the nth degree. And the novel, the actual story, stalled out completely. And the world I built was amazing, but I'd lost interest in the story by then. But conversely, I know people who love that part of the process. They love the world building, and that stimulates the story. For me, story comes first. It killed the story for me. So the next time around, started with story, started with character, built the world out from there, finished the first draft, went back, fixed all the problems that we had created along the way. So, yeah, I think if you're not somebody who is incredibly self-disciplined, it's easy to get distracted by the world building. And you do have to know all those details, but you don't have to know them on the first page. You don't have to know them when you start.
No, but I usually get anxious to get started. And then I probably haven't done enough world building. And so I have to add it as I go. So I should do more to start, but I'm pretty anxious to get going.
I tend to look for ways to limit my world building because I will do exactly what you're talking about. I'll keep on doing it. Research is fun, and world building is really fun. And so I like to set a time limit on my world building. And for a new series, I mean, sometimes when I did the Fallen series, I spent 3 months world building. But I set aside 3 months to world build. So it wasn't that it got out of hand. That was what I gave myself, and I got it done. And so I like to set a time limit for myself, and I like to base, particularly with the historical stuff I've done, I like to base my world building on a series of questions. And once the questions are answered, I move on. Now, answering questions usually begets more questions, but at some point you reach a saturation level where the number of new questions is leveling off, and that's when I know, okay, I've done what I need to do. It's time for me to get to the end. But yeah, that's a constant danger, that sense of, ooh, if I just follow this new shiny, there'll be something, yeah.
Down the rabbit hole.
Yes.
I hit a research wall on volcanoes. I don't know a lot about volcanoes, okay? I'm the only kid that never made a baking soda volcano. And I needed more, so I started stalking volcanologists on Twitter until one of them foolishly followed me back and admitted in his profile that he liked science fiction. So I DM'd him. Hi there, I'm writing a book about science fiction with volcanoes in it. Can you help me get it right? And he was awesome. He, Jamie Parkinson, based in France, and he would answer my long and difficult questions on his French lunch hour, and I'd have the answer at 8 o'clock the next morning. And he would send stop-motion video of volcanic eruptions and news clippings of aircraft flying close to the smoke plume and stuff. And that went on for 2 months, and that was just the volcanoes. But in the end, he gets an acknowledgement, and I got an email saying, nailed it. So very happy about that. But yeah, I was pretty obsessive, and part of it for me was because I don't feel like as a master craftsman, but I wanted to get the world right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we run through one of them. This one stymies me too. Given that we only have one life-bearing sample to work from, isn't internally consistent world building impossible? I'm not quite sure why they concluded that from our, that leads to the alien aspect, I think.
I just finished reading excellent book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet.
I just finished that too.
Isn't that great?
It was well done.
Yeah. She had a little blurb in there about why all the alien species look pretty much the same. Well, to a point, which I thought was a little bit of a cop-out. But all her alien species that she developed, anything she developed about them ended up in the book for a good reason. And I think that's what you have to do when you're developing your characters. Their characteristics have to be there for a reason.
I would agree, and I think also the world building isn't there just for the fun of it. Mm-hmm. It has to serve a purpose as well. But I confess I don't even know what that question means.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what it means.
Okay, good. Moving on.
But I'm gonna throw in a contrarian thing. I think that world building with a purpose can lead to contrivance. You don't want to create a world to match your story. I think if you have ideas for your story, you create a world and you look for ways to build in those elements that are going to help your story along, but you can't stop there. You don't want your world to feel like a prefab house. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And so that would be my one caveat. And I'm not saying that that's what you did, but just the way it was phrased was, it seemed a little too utilitarian for me.
I'm thinking more along the lines of push and pull. So, I create a world that's a desert. That's going to inform how my characters treat water.
Sure.
And, that in turn might inform the way I build structures in my world.
Yes, okay.
Blah, blah,
Oh,
blah. That sort of thing.
absolutely.
It can't just be random, I guess is
Right.
what I'm saying.
No, that's, okay, yeah.
We're friends again.
Yes.
Yeah. No, and I think you raise a good point. I conceived of a new planet, unspoilt by human occupation, industry, and all of our other issues, and I wanted to keep it very environmentally green. And I eventually realized that starving colonists are not going to quibble over having a wood fire to cook their food, and you cannot take it to the nth degree. You have to allow for people to prosper and thrive and meet their needs.
Right.
So I had to bring it back, and I said, okay, well, they're going to have beeswax candles, and they're going to have wood fires when they need them. They're going to have vegetable oil lanterns, and make it a livable world.
Yeah. I mean, I live in a country that has spent much of its history using its sense of what its history ought to be to kind of bend the environment and the culture that has developed in it, and the results are never pretty. And so if we world build that way, I think we risk. And again, I'm not saying that, but world building needs to be organic to the story, but it also needs to have elements that you develop and you're not even sure yet how you're going to use them. But they're there because the hindbrain has figured out that sooner or later it's going to come up and you're going to need a certain thing. And so I guess what I'm saying is sometimes in world building it's okay to go down the rabbit holes for a little while, because invariably those rabbit holes are going to become warrens and you're going to use them, but you just don't know how yet.
I want to talk about influences, and because I only brought 2 influences, I'm going to throw mine out there first so I get to it first. When I had questions about...
See, being moderator is kind of fun,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
There's
I'm
curves.
underprepared, so I'm going to go first. When I needed an answer, I sat in front of one of these panels once, and I flabbergasted the panel by asking them, how do you show what is not there? And nobody had an answer for that because it came out of the blue. But there I was, writing a book in which there were no metals for the surface dwellers, and I didn't know how to get that across without having some character saying, gee, this knife would be a lot sharper if it was made of steel. Because my main character is 14 and she's never seen a steel knife in her life. In fact, the first time she comes across a pair of scissors, she thinks they fold closed to protect the valuable metal. So, couldn't get an answer from a panel, so I went reading. And my brother reminded me about Courtship Right by Donald Kingsbury. It's not getting a lot of oohs and ahs, but it is an absolutely mind-boggling book about a culture so far removed from its human roots that the kids who live there have only ever seen 2 or 3 Earth-like animals. And one of the most beautiful tricks that Donald Kingsbury uses to reveal this is he has a festival of the horse. They brought horses with them, but the horses became extinct. But they still celebrate them because they were important to their startup colony. And he has them do like Halloween costumes of the horse. And they are so far-fetched. They're blue and green and feathered. That you know these kids have never seen a horse. They have never seen a picture of a horse. And mythos is one of the ways that I learned that you can convey what is not there. And another one that I like to particularly mention on that topic is inappropriate metaphor. On a world without metal, nobody refers to the iron fist, the bronze tan, the leaden skies, because those words are not in their day-to-day lexicon, and to use them would not convey an image. And the other one that was to use rare examples and on workarounds. So they eat with chopsticks, and they sew with needles of bone, and they make their coins of glass. And I had fun with all of that, and it does paint a nice, rich world. And I could go on about it for hours and add right for the senses. But let's move around the table instead and say, do you have a pet favorite trick or an aspect of world building that you feel that you've brought a degree of mastery to?
No.
See, the beginner's egotistical.
No, not really. But in the latest one that has been published by the Wild Rose Press, it's called Alien Innkeeper. And there's aliens and people from Mars. And the Martian woman is always having some human expression. And then the aliens are questioning, well, what does that mean? Literally, you have just said blah, blah, but we have no idea what you mean. So I've done quite a bit of that in that particular novel.
And I do think it's the details. It's those telling little cultural details. I wouldn't say I had any particular literary influences, but I'm fairly well traveled, and I don't just visit. I tend to live in the places I go to. So I lived in Japan for a while, for instance, and people's relationships to personal space are different there. The etiquette, there are layers of etiquette that we can't begin to touch, or at least there were back in 1990, whatever year I was there, a long time ago. So
When you were just a wee thing.
when I was so young. So I love looking at other cultures and seeing the differences, and that informs my thinking when I sit down to write, because we do come to the page with a lot of bias and talking about the mythos, and even something as simple as swearing. What's our swear word? And I'm trying to think of it was Dust, the novel Dust. Sorry.
Hugh
Author.
Howey.
No, different Dust.
Okay.
Different Dust. And it was a generation ship traveling through the galaxies, and what were people scared of? What did they hate? Space.
Vacuum.
Space was their swear word, because that was the thing that terrified them. And so
That was their bogeyman.
that was their bogeyman. So you think about that, what are the things that we use as our bad words here? In other times even in our own history, those weren't terrible words. I mean, there was a time when if you said damn, that was far, far worse than using the F word, for example. So, so I love taking the cultures I've visited and lived in and thinking about how they do things differently than we do, and then bringing that to the page.
I saw a spark in your eyes when the topic of swear words came up.
Gotta love it.
Unleash upon us.
No, I think I won't. But yeah, I the language of a place and the way it reflects history and religion and all those human institutions I was talking about at the beginning of the panel, I find that fascinating. And you brought up before kind of the dangers of anachronistic language. I'm fascinated by that, and I love being able to bring to bear in my storytelling a way of speaking and a way of expressing anger or love or whatever that reinforces the world building, just the way our own, the more colorful elements of our language reinforce the realities of the world that we live in.
We color in our worldview, don't we?
Yeah, yeah.
We paint our own world in colors of perception, and we use language to do that.
Yeah.
I just read an interesting article about the use of standard English for American or Canadian or Australian business people who go to Europe to take a stint at, say, the Brussels head office, and they use idioms that are completely foreign. And eventually they discover that when the Swedes and the Italians and the French are talking to each other, they actually use a very limited vocabulary of literal and perhaps to the outside observer rather colorless English. They don't say things like, there's more than one way to skin a cat, because your Italian board chairman just looks at you like you're dropped out of space. So language is obviously an important aspect of world building. Looking down to my notes here. They're very short notes. What about holidays? Different people celebrate different holidays. In Japan, you probably encountered different holidays. And that's another way that we reinforce our culture. You know, we celebrate things like Canada Day or Saint Jean Baptiste Day, and we mark our cultural commonalities and our waypoints with holidays. Do you use holidays in your writing, any of you?
I do, and what's interesting about the series that I'm working on right now is we have two worlds that the book goes back and forth on. And the one world is a dead or dying world, and they've lost most of their culture. And so this was interesting. We'd get to a point and we'd say, oh, we need to have a holiday here, but what do these people celebrate when they have their cultures dead? And, you know, so we had to find something very banal and inane, and even the celebration was nothing of note. And it was interesting to but you had to look at it out of their eyes and go, okay, even this small thing would be a holiday and a celebration to these people who have nothing left of their culture.
Yeah, the creation of a holiday, and the key word being there, the creation of a holiday, is something that I think is very much tied to technology and the ability to communicate the existence of said holiday across vast distances and populations. When I'm writing fantasy, I tend to write in more pastoral, less technologically advanced societies, and so most of the holidays are days that are tied to the turn of the year, the turn of the seasons, much more like pagan holidays.
Nature days.
Yeah, and so those tend to be, now, how I name them and which gods or goddesses are honored on those days, that's all the world building. But it's, you know, there's no way for me in a quasi-medieval society, or even the thing I'm writing right now is kind of flintlock era stuff. But even then, there's no way to say, hey, set aside the third Tuesday in October because it's going to be a holiday. You can't do that
Because of the lack of calendars. And
yeah, lack of
communications.
yeah. It's just yeah.
Well, I'm going to move on to the topic of technology then, and I'm going to kick it off to give you a feel for what I'm talking about. You lit this one off in my mind when you said when you write fantasy, you have a lower technological explanation. I straddled the gap. I have two cultures on my world. The surface dwellers have low technology because no metal, so no steam engines, no electricity, no blah, blah, blah. But they've hung on to agriculture and literacy and probably mathematics, although it doesn't feature heavily. And they've kept some conveniently appropriate technologies like semaphore. Because why shouldn't they? I mean, you know, just because they've been busted halfway back to the Stone Age doesn't mean they have to give things up. And actually a pet peeve of mine is that people underestimate the cultural depth of Stone Age peoples because we have perhaps an arrowhead, but we don't have the beautiful decorated arrow shaft, which may have mystic carvings or animal dyes or colored feathers or feathers from the right bird spirit. And we don't have the composite materials that the bow is lovingly made out of elk horn, sandwiched with ash, held together with animal glues. We tend to see, oh, they had stone tools. Right. They were Stone Age. And we forget about the feathered headdresses and the gold wire jewelry and the ornate leatherwork or beadwork that these cultures had. And they presumably had music and song and dance that, and this would, I think, be universal. So I got sidetracked, but technological evenness, and I brought it up because I celebrate the disparity between two societies and their different cultural levels. How do you set about having a consistent science or a consistent understanding or a consistent set of social tools like agriculture? Or do other examples appeal to you?
I think a little inconsistency would be nice.
Jazz it up a bit.
Yeah. So I try to throw that a little bit of that in, but it's not that easy.
No, it wouldn't be, but it would be very strange if alien cultures discovered the cell phone and the LCD display at the same time like we did. So do you play with that when you go looking for inconsistencies? Do you have alien cultures that have some things we've never dreamt of because it's a priority,
Yes.
and some things that we gave up decades? I mean, we can't build a decent wooden ship anymore. Can you share an example? Something
It
that
has
helps?
to fit in with the story, which is tricky. And that's a little bit, I find, if I find something that I think they would have that's different, that's how the culture comes out. They discover it from each other, and then that's how the culture comes out. So it's kind of background material, but it's coming out in the story.
Technology plays a really important role in the series that I'm writing because I said we have two worlds, and they're two very technologically different worlds. The dying planet has advanced technology, but no resources.
Right.
The rich world has a very primitive level of technology, but is rich in resources. And we
That's
didn't.
not going to end well.
I
No,
know. I
you
can
know
smell
how
the
that goes.
exploitation from here.
You know how that goes. And we didn't set out to write social commentary at all, but it was interesting how much of it kept informing the writing as we went, and the path when your technology becomes more and more advanced. And we lament about it today, and some of it's true, and some of it I think is hyperbole and people getting worked up. But our technology has changed us, and I think it has segregated us to a large degree and taken away a lot of art. It's created community, but it's created an artificial community. We're missing that face-to-face human in a lot of places. So yeah, I love to play with technology, and it can be super frustrating because you can build yourself nice obstacles when you need a plot point, but you don't have the technology to meet it. But that's a good challenge.
Yeah, my first series had a somewhat similar dichotomy. It was magic and pastoral versus highly technological and advanced, and that didn't end well either. But when you're talking about consistency and how inconsistency is something to be used, if you think about human history and you go back 3,000 years and you put yourself in Europe or in Asia or in, say, the Middle East, you're going to find very different levels of technology in each place and very different cultures developing. And those inconsistencies, if you're doing your world building well, you tie them to desert or whatever sort of natural resources are available, and all of a sudden those inconsistencies seem very consistent in their variety, if that makes sense. And so I think playing with those types of inconsistencies is a really good idea.
And sometimes what we look at as primitive, I lived in the Bahamas for a little while, and the tool there was the machete. The machete hacked off the palm fronds. It split open your coconuts. You weeded the garden with it. The machete was a multi-tool. And look at us, you go into a Home Depot and you pay $60 for a shovel and $40 for this. Are we smarter?
I could have had a machete.
I could have just bought a machete. It is a little unnerving the first time you show up and everybody's waving machetes around, but there's that.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of the joy of coming out of Home Hardware with my proudly acquired $40 machete and getting on the bus. Sorry, I just thought of Greyhound and that wasn't funny. I was thinking of a city bus in a different situation. You talked about your spacefaring generation ship. What's the population, and do they function as a village?
Oh, no, that wasn't mine.
That wasn't yours.
No,
that
no.
was Dust. That was something
was
you
Dust,
read.
yes.
Yeah, because population size has to be one of the defining factors of cultural breadth. And I think you touched on how our technical society lets us build new cultural links between each other, but there's a tendency to seek out the like-minded, unlike the little village where the young and the old and the married and the single and the widowed all coexisted and they all had their own jobs. We're moving into an area of specialization, where as a pilot, a large number of my friends are fellow pilots. Even some of my science fiction writing friends are pilots, which I'm really proud of finding a couple more Skyfly guys. But
Skyfly, nice. Nice. That's terrible. That's nice.
God, I thought I was good coming up with chocolate punk, but nobody's buying that.
Oh, I want it.
Chalk punk. Look for it. No.
When my Thieftaker series started, it's historical urban fantasy set in pre-revolutionary Boston. And for some reason, I went to DragonCon the year the first book came out, and they put me on all the steampunk panels. Yeah,
Because it's a thing.
because it's alternate history, and so I write tricorn punk.
All right.
Trademark.
Age of Sail? Age of Sail is when you say tricorn, I hear Age of Sail.
Yeah, tricorn punk. That's what and all of a sudden, I mean, it became a thing at DragonCon. No place, and so the next year I was interviewed in the Daily Dragon. They were, so tell us, what is tricorn punk? And it's like, it's something I said on a panel last year.
And anyway, isn't it self-explanatory?
Yeah, really, seriously. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
No, not really. Population size affects culture, technology level affects culture, environment affects culture. Are we missing any?
Yeah, well,
Or-
climate.
Climate.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Competition for resources.
You know, to a certain degree, I'm gonna do your job for just a second, because I
Please.
have something I'd love to.
Because, I only got this job like 30 minutes ago, and I'm not going to last as long as Scaramucci.
Oh, burn.
Thank God.
Burn.
Oh God.
Sorry.
Thank you. Boy, did you just derail my. I was going to say that it's great to talk about world building ideas, and it's great to talk about the worlds that we do and what we're playing with. But you have a room full of people who are writers, and us up here, and every one of us is going to be writing a different world, and every one of us is going to be creating a different world. So I would love to know from my fellow writers less what you're doing with your world and more how you're doing it. Do you have tools you use when you're creating worlds? Do you have research places you go to that help you with your world creation? Do you have software tools that you use to keep track of all the crap you're coming up with? So that, because sometimes tools like that for aspiring writers can be a really helpful set of things to know.
So when I first started world building way back when, I just Googled world building, and there's some excellent resources just with lists of questions. You talked about your list of questions. Those are so important. And my favorite question to answer, and this sounds really simple, is where does the poo go?
No,
But-
that's a great thought, because that
But you
gets
gotta
into all
figure that
sorts-
out.
Yeah.
You can build this wonderful society. Where do people go to the bathroom? And where does it go from there? And
Okay, I'm thinking of Holy Grail, where it says, yeah, he must be the king, he doesn't have any shit on him.
no, but I mean, I do start with a list of questions like you do. Basic stuff. Who picks up the garbage? Where does the garbage go? Where does the water come from? Do you have to go and get the water out of a well? Does it come through a pipe? And then, of course, your technology level is going to dictate a lot of that. But these could be plot elements down the road that you have to be aware of. The food issue, that's a huge issue. Where is your food grown? How's it grown? What's your main source of food? For our dying planet that had no natural resource, we're like, what are their weapons going to be? Because they're running out of metal. And so we came up with an animal that has ferrous spines, and they harvest the spines, and that's what they shoot through with an impeller type weapon.
As a projectile weapon.
As a projectile weapon, and they basically slice through you. But we thought, this is the one animal, it's going to be this weird sort of lobster porcupine creature that can live off filth. So it's cleaning the filth, it's making their weapons. They can also use its extrusions to make fibers, which can be clothes. So yeah, there's lots of good sources online to find lists of questions and go through them. What's the currency? What's the value? What's a high-paying occupation? What's a low-paying occupation? Why? Et cetera.
Those are way better questions than I started with. I started with, I want aviation, so how much gravity can I get by? How much atmosphere can I have? I probably need a rotating planet with day and night to keep the winds stable, and that means I'm going to have weather. And this is where I went down my rabbit hole of world building, and I started looking up what happens when you have a heavy atmosphere and you live under 4 or 5 atmospheres. And you suffer from nitrogen narcosis, what they used to call rapture of the deeps, when scuba was invented, and oxygen toxicity. So there are limits. So a lot of times when I'm reading science fiction, I'm distressed by the fact that the worlds are so extraordinarily Earth-like, and yet, you know what, so is mine. The day is slightly longer, the atmosphere is slightly thicker, and it doesn't have a moon, which has several knock-on effects, actually. But gee whiz, the year is about the same, and the air is oxygen, nitrogen, because if you make it out of anything else, you've got to have rebreathers and gills, and it gets out of control for telling a story about recognizably human people. But you don't have that limitation. You don't have to tell. Are your aliens usually interacting with humans? Or
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so where do we meet them?
When I want to start a new novel, I have this tin. Anytime I think of a word that I want to put, I put it in that tin. For example, bowling, RCMP, things like that, just words. So I've got this tin full of ideas. I pick out 3 or 4. Okay, the novel is going to be based on these 3 or 4 ideas. And that's where I start trying to put them all together. It's just a way of
Right, yeah.
yeah.
Forcing your brain into gear.
Yeah, I don't know how to start, so I thought, okay, I'll take 3 or 4 ideas out. That's what it has to be, and then go from there.
And I think don't be afraid to reach out to experts in a field. You would be shocked how much, and the more they know in an area, and specifically if it's a niche area, they love to talk about it. I have a mushroom expert, and I recently contacted this fellow. He is way up there in the Zeppelin world. They're not airships, they're Zeppelins. And he was amazing. He called me back within half an hour and talked my ear off for 2 hours. They're shockingly happy to help you.
Yeah.
I'd like to second that for a moment, because A, my volcanologist buddy, and B, I realized I should give back, and I do aviation consulting for science fiction, and I'm doing a presentation tomorrow on writing aviation in fiction and nonfiction. And we won't go into it here about how aviation is misrepresented, but your Zeppelin guy is a great example. And yes, I actually had some fairly well-known authors contact me and said, I put this in a book. Does it work? And I said, it works beautifully from the character's point of view when this airplane arrives at the airport. But it doesn't work from the pilot's point of view. He would never do that. He could not. He would not do that any more than you would drive your car across a bed of nails. And I'm not going into the specifics because I'm sworn to secrecy, because it's all been fixed now. But if you're interested in writing aviation, and everybody should be, because even Tolkien had the hobbits ride home on eagles, and it was just to speed up the trip, so that it took us 8 months to get there. We don't want to spend 8 months getting back. It would be anticlimactic. Aviation can do more for your story than that. But
You do that 8 times in a year, you get a free trip on an eagle.
And it's a nicer ride than with United, or so I've heard.
Yes.
you look like you have a question, and actually I was going to throw it open very soon. So go ahead.
How high tech are you? Because I have answers for every level of technology.
Start at the bottom.
Okay. And what kind of computer do you use? Okay. Have you heard of Scrivener? Okay. Start using it. Scrivener is a marvelous program. You can use it for storing data, for creating places and keeping track of them with their attributes, and they even have prompts on each place name where it'll ask you, role in the story, climatological things, stuff like that. Scrivener is a wonderful tool. You can also store websites in Scrivener, and it will, so if you find a website you love, you save it to Scrivener, and it saves everything so that you'll go back to the website. You still need to have the internet connection, but it's so fast, it's instantaneous, and you have all that information at your fingertips at all times. So Scrivener is one. For those people who aren't as tech savvy or who just don't like to use tech, I have those metal boxes that hold index cards. I have a lot of those. And they're filled with place names, character names, names of devices or things or creatures that I have created for the various novels. But you write all that stuff down because you don't want... My fear, I can't do what you do. I can't create a world as I go. Because then I'll start saying, well, it would be really convenient if my world did this now. And what I like to do is create the rules ahead of time and then have to build in creative workarounds when my world doesn't match what my characters need. Because that tension between what the world allows and what the character needs quite often can form the core of 18 books, that sort of thing. So.
I agree. And Scrivener is great because you can go into the metadata and you can change it to whatever you want. I use it for POVs because we have a lot of different POVs in our books, but you can change it to cities, you could change it to languages, you could make the metadata whatever you want, and then it'll show you scene by scene, chapter by chapter, what you've got as far as language, city, culture, whatever. And I kept, we have a lot of different cultures in our books. I have a glossary, I've got a Bible, and write it down. You will forget it.
Yes.
Guarantee you.
And create maps?
Maps, yeah.
I didn't draw enough maps. You have a question? I'll come to you in a moment. Oh, do you want to jump in now? I'm comfortable in Paint Shop Pro, but the learning curve is even worse than Scrivener, and I didn't realize that Scrivener had all those capabilities.
There are cartography programs, and if you think a little creatively, you can find what you need. I would imagine there are, I don't know this for a fact, but I would imagine there are landscaping programs that allow you to kind of create your garden, or there are programs that golf course designers use to create the topography of a golf course that you could buy and use, not to create a golf course, but to create a world. And I mean, a lot of times writing is all about adaptation and looking for ways to take a world that doesn't value writers or writing and turn it into a world that you can exploit.
I hate making maps.
I-
Hate it.
Yeah,
But you know what? I was lucky because the world that I had to work in, my partner handles the other world. The world I had to work in was a very watery world. So I just took a chunk of the BC coast, flipped it around, moved a few inlets, done.
Oh, I smell Xanth. Xanth was, here's Anthony, and it was Florida
Yeah,
turned
sure.
upside down. I drew a volcano profile, and then I drew a volcano topography because I needed to work out how much land area there was. Volcanoes are skinny at the top and wide at the bottom. So there's lots of land down by the sea, but on my world that's not very habitable. It's too hot, and it's not agriculturally viable. So the pressure is on my culture to live in the temperate zone, but there's not nearly as much temperate land as there is tropical land and torrid land. And I had to work out, the main character runs away from home and she has to travel a significant distance around the volcano to get to her refuge. And so there I am measuring the circumference of this volcano at different elevations and working out the ambient temperature and going overboard again. But I have those diagrams, I kept them, and all the notes on the oxygen, partial pressure, and all the stuff that I had to look up, I kept it, because I know that when I come to this school, I'm going to need it.
There is really something to be said for doing way more research and work than you need to do for what you show your readers.
Oh, none of it's in the book.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, this is all like below ground. and
Yeah.
It seeps up occasionally between lines.
Well, and I think that when you do that kind of research, the weight of the research you've done is conveyed even in a fraction of the language you need to describe it. I mean, I have a scene in which there's a wheelwright working in one of my books, in the first book of the Forland series. And I spent an entire day learning about wheelwrights for literally one sentence. But I really felt as though the research I did lended weight to that one sentence, because I didn't have to write it in a way that explained anything, because I understood it well enough that I didn't need to explain it to myself as I was writing it, if that makes sense.
And also serendipity. I was at a winery in
Don't
Prince
call me that. I've never liked that.
I was at a winery in Prince Edward County, and because I was at CanCon in Ottawa and I had a day to spare. And one of the wineries had their own barrel maker. And I said, oh, geez, tell me something. I have this world without metal, and I want to have wine barrels. Can I do it? Can I tie a barrel shut with rope instead of steel banding? Is there a repair technique? And even though he was the kind of artisan that works with his hands, he wasn't good with written words, but he wrote me a long email explaining how you could make a barrel with rope and a toggle to tighten the rope, or you could do it with like withy and shrink it, or you could just do it with wood. There were all kinds of ways to build a barrel without metal. And he was, like you said, just so happy that somebody cared about his darn barrels.
And I was going to add on to what you were saying. I think when it comes to world building, a lot of the mistake that gets made when you're first starting out is you go for breadth instead of depth.
Mm-hmm.
Worlds where you can see the depth are always, to me, far more interesting than a big wide world with lots and lots of cultures and lots of, go deeply into the one or two or three cultures on your world. Go deeply into an environment. Go deeply, and most of the stuff you figure out isn't going to be on your page, but it will come through in your writing.
One other point that struck me as you were saying that, because it's the devil's in the details, and it's the invisible foundation to some of those details that propels the world from it was like a Mars-like Class M planet, into a place where people live. And point of view of the character, it's very important to be faithful to that. And I fought with 3 beta readers and 2 editors before I finally gave up and admitted that the rings Raisa looks at when she looks at the sky are planetary rings. And just once I agreed to call them planetary rings, because when we look at the moon, we don't say, look, it's that Earth-orbiting natural satellite created 4.5 billion years ago, we say, oh, the moon is full. And for her, it was the same. She looked at the rings, and she looked at how lit they were to tell the time of day, but she took it for granted that they were there.
Yeah.
But when I wrote rings, everybody went, what? Playground rings, gymnastic rings, finger rings, toe rings? What kind of rings?
You see,
Criminal rings? Like
I would have agreed with you totally that you don't call them planetary rings. You find some other way to convey what they are, but you don't say it because point of view. For me, point of view is everything.
It is, and I described them 6 ways from Sunday, and nobody got it. So finally, I had to find an excuse for Raisa to look at the sky and think of them just once as what they were, instead of what she was. I would much rather she took them for granted.
Yeah.
But it was just losing people. And I had a nice scene where she went out at night. We're at 10:02. Did anybody give us a hand sign? I didn't see anybody stick by.
Oh, yeah, we just
10
got
minutes. I'm looking at my notes. I'm looking at my co-panelists. Okay, thank you. So we have just time for a couple of quick questions, or we got to pull out now? Okay. All right. So does anybody else have a question? Okay. I'll start at the back in the red shirt.
Well, where does the poo go is a really good one to start with. So I was thinking, when I think of world building, I also think of research. So the series I set in Boston, set in pre-revolutionary Boston. When I was creating that, when I was building that world and doing all my research, I thought of that as world building as well. And so, so a question that came to mind for that was, when did they invent oil lamps in Boston? And the corollary question for a fantasy world would be, what kind of light is there in the street at night? Because while we write these books and we're writing about cultures that exist, for me in fantasy worlds, most of the culture exists during the daytime, because nighttime was a scary time for people back before electricity and everything. But the characters, they're doing their stuff at night, because my characters tend to be shady. They tend to be doing things that they don't want other people to see. And so knowing what that environment looks like at night and what challenges come to my readers, to my characters through darkness in a city or in a small town, that was really valuable. And like the where does the poo go question, it has so many corollary questions about technology, about what they have at their disposal and what they don't. So things that are incredibly mundane. How do they prepare their food? If they have fires in their house, where do they put them? And do they have the ability to create a masonry container for that fire? Things of that sort. Really mundane stuff that get at lifestyle, but then imply so much for when lifestyle is forced into the unusual circumstance.
Okay, I think you get the last question.
How do you go so far down the rabbit hole that it hasn't been done before without losing the reader's ability to relate?
Wow, that is a mouthful.
That's a great question.
I tried to find a balance between the unfamiliar and the familiar, so that I didn't want to explain day and night, even though the day is slightly different. So I used the planetary rings and the way the sun lights them at night. So in the early evening, the rings are bright towards the sunset, but dark behind you. And then at midnight, there's two horns on the horizon, but the overhead is dark. And I used visual imagery like that to convey an alien space, but the familiarity of night. And I went a little bit further, and I wrote a nice sentence about the quality of the shadows, because I worked out it'd be like standing under a string of Christmas lights. The shadows would be blurry one way and sharp the other.
If you have a critique group or beta readers, you'll get lots of feedback on what makes sense and what doesn't. They'll let you know.
Have you read China Mieville? Read Parita Street Station, because it's out there, and he makes it work, and he makes it relatable, and it's one of those books that is challenging because of exactly what you're talking about.
Does that satisfy? Yeah, excellent. Okay, thanks everybody for coming to World Building.
Thank you.